my name is Claire Edwards and I'm here today with Professor Tom Butler. Hello, Tom.
Hello.
And we're going to talk about the BBC Click programme that was broadcast on the 9th of November and address some of the claims that were made in that programme. So, Tom, tell us, are you concerned about 5G?
I'm very concerned about 5G. 5G is just the latest innovation in and around wireless technologies, all of which are based on non-ionizing radio frequency radiation. And I'm as concerned about 5G as I was concerned about 4G, 3G, 2G and Wi-Fi. Mm-hmm. They've all been proven to have significant health effects. Mm-hmm. There are thousands of studies which demonstrate this. In fact, one can go back ever before this to 1976, and the US Navy's Naval Medical Research Institute catalogued 3,700 studies which documented thermal and non-thermal effects.
The biological effects.
Biological effects on human beings, and also on other animals, obviously, who are being used for experimental purposes. So we have long known of these effects. It really puzzles me as to how we have amnesia, especially the industry, who have known about these effects and have conducted their own studies. In the 90s, for example, there was a significant $25 million study conducted in the United States, whose results indicated that the existence for the industry of non-thermal effects. The study was pretty much sidelined and forgotten about. However, Dr. George Carlo, who was the chief scientist, shall we say, who conducted the study, published a book subsequently. And
the BBC programme tells us that there's no sufficient evidence that there are dangers from 5G.
Well, one needs to look at the results of the two recent studies published in 2018. The US Department of Health's National Toxicology Program study, which was the largest and longest of its kind, which demonstrated and provided clear evidence, which is the highest burden of scientific proof, and this was a peer-reviewed study, that exposure to radio frequency radiation from 2 and 3G sources caused cancers in rats, cancers of the central nervous system and the heart. And that was near field, that this was exposures to 2 and 3G sources that come from your mobile phone, for example, whereas the Ramazzini study was looking at far field radiation, which is the type of exposure you get from antennae. And again, that was one of a number of studies going back to the 90s, which indicated that exposure to relatively weak fields of radio frequency radiation was causing cancers and other health issues, mainly of neurological depression and so on and so forth, in people who are living close, within 300 metres, effectively from an antenna source.
And I noticed that the programme only addresses the issue of an antenna, but there was an EU report earlier this year which was talking about the concerns surrounding interference effects.
Yeah, well, when you look at the way they were testing the antenna, and they found, I think it was 500 times the permitted level at the surface of the antenna. Now, they're being a bit disingenuous there, because 500 times the official guideline, and these are only guidelines, and they're technical guidelines, and they're to prevent thermal or heating effects. In other words, preventing engineers from getting fried who are working on antennas. And these levels are, relatively speaking, quite high, and they have a 30-minute exposure.
Only 30 minutes?
Only 30 minutes at that level.
So 24/7 exposure, these safety guidelines
No,
do not permit
absolutely not.
that. Okay.
As a matter of fact, right, and just sticking with the, as I remember it, when they were measuring the power level down from the antenna, if that was a 5G antenna, it more than likely is beam formed, which means that the beam is concentrated, and all you'd be picking up at that point is a side lobe, and if a side lobe at all. So you'd be picking up an extremely weak signal.
Mm-hmm.
However, that antenna was probably pointing at a building a couple of 100 yards away or less, which means that anybody in that building was going to be exposed to potentially significantly higher levels.
Mm-hmm.
Now, having said that, the European Academy of Environmental Medicine quite recently came out with what the physicians and the scientists in the academy reckon is the safe exposure for adults, which is 1 million times less.
1 million times.
And this is daytime exposure,
Mhm.
right? For adults, the nighttime exposure is 10 million times less
Mhm.
than
Mhm.
the safety
Mhm.
guidelines that the UK government
Mhm.
implement. But for children, these levels are in orders of magnitude, or should be much, much less.
Because of course children have smaller bodies.
They're more susceptible.
Yes. As well as women have smaller bodies, so they're more susceptible.
Exactly.
And do we actually see that reflected in the cancer rates? More cancers for women?
Yeah, well, Dr. David Grimes has quoted that as saying or indicating that that there's no uptick in cancer levels. When you look at the recent epidemiological studies coming out of the US, for example, and those have only been published in 2018, you will see them reporting statistically significant increases in cancers of the central nervous system, and for example gliomas, which are a particular type of aggressive brain tumours, in adolescents and in young adults.
Mm-hmm.
There's also been published again last year studies on the significant increase in colon rectal cancers,
Mm-hmm.
again in adults and in young adults. And one would say, well, where are they coming from? And scientists in the US are concerned that these are linked with the practice of kids and young adults carrying their phones in their back pockets or front pockets.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the one thing we can say, the one smoking gun we can say with absolute certainty, is the decrease in male fertility.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been linked in repeated studies with exposure to radio frequency radiation from cell phones being carried in pockets.
Mm-hmm. Can we address the issue of ionising and non-ionising radiation? Because we're constantly told non-ionising radiation does not break DNA. But I've seen a patent which was filed by Swisscom in 2004, which actually said that electrosmog causes DNA damage.
Well, we're talking about two different things here.
Mm-hmm.
In ionizing radiation is of extremely high energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the photons that ionizing radiation sources transmit are very high energy, and these can directly cause breaks in DNA, single strand and double strand breaks, right?
Mm-hmm.
That have sufficient energy to do so.
Mm-hmm.
You take, for example, weaker forms of shall we say, light energy, UVA and UVB. UVB has sufficient energy to break DNA strands, and therefore, and that by no means leads to cancers, because the body has natural defences to repair such breakages, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason we can have exposure to sunlight and not get melanomas. But UVA doesn't have the same level of power. And what it does is it puts cells into what's known as oxidative stress.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are thousands of studies which demonstrate that oxidative stress is a precursor for cancers, because through molecular actions of reactive oxygen species, the DNA strands can be broken. So the mechanisms by which DNA strand breaks can happen and cancers can occur eventually are different for non-ionizing radiation, because
the mechanisms are different, but it can still break DNA even if it's non-ionizing radiation.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's been proven scientifically in many studies.
Okay. Now, one of the other things that we were told in the programme was that 5G has been tested down the years, or not 5G, but 3G, 4G, all of these things have been tested. Is that correct?
No, they've only been tested in terms of their thermal capacities. In other words, the thermal effects, the heating effects. They certainly haven't been tested by the industry, at least that I'm aware of. As to their effects, the radio frequency radiation effects on general human health and well-being. And these are the non-thermal effects, which are very well documented in thousands of studies. You compare what the telecoms industry have done with 2, 3, 4G and 5G, compared to what, say, a pharmaceutical company would need to do. They would need to do experimental studies in animals to demonstrate that there are no side effects, for example. And yet the telecoms industry haven't been asked to, nor obliged to do this. And this is of great concern to me in terms of the systemic risk that this new technology exposes on a 24/7 basis the entire human population right at this point in time. Because if we go back to what I was saying a while ago about the mechanisms, right? We're all exposed to environmental stressors, right? From pollution, right? And even from natural sources as well. But the body reacts to that at a cellular level through antioxidants, which neutralize the harmful reactive oxygen species that are created as a result of oxidative stress. So, given time, our body can heal itself or can achieve an equilibrium in its operation. But if we're exposed on a continuous basis to environmental stressors and the body doesn't have time to heal itself, then you're going to see problems on a society-wide scale.
And of course we're talking about devices in the home, antennas.
Yes, it's everywhere now.
There's the 5G satellites which are going up, so the level of exposure is going to be...
It's going to be quite dramatic, but I think, and it was touched on briefly, but not really followed through by one of the experts, is that the radiation from our devices in the home, our smartphones, is much more worrisome, and he seemed to be worried about it, than the radiation from antennas. But what he didn't really and follow through on logically was that it's the cumulative and total exposure, that is, all of these power densities, both from far field sources such as antenna and near field sources from our smartphones, from our Wi-Fi routers, from our Internet of Things homes, all of these things add up, right? And it's like having, say, one person smoking in a room as opposed to having 10 people smoking in a room. You can visualize the amount of pollution that's going to be in the air. And the problem is we can't see electrosmog, we can't see radio frequency radiation. And so we're unaware of its total effect.
So we can definitely say then that we do not know the biological effects of 5G.
Yes, we do.
Okay, do tell.
5G, the workhorse of 5G is going to be the same basically as 4G LTE, which is the broadband exposure, right? So it's going to be, they use the same type of frequency modulation, and here's the problem, is that by some accident of innovation, telecommunications engineers and scientists have picked on the worst possible type of modulation, pulsed frequency modulation, both for all of the mobile telecommunications, but particularly for 4G, Wi-Fi, and now 5G, because it has the greatest impact on biological systems and in human systems, and this has been demonstrated in rats and mice. And when we test any of our drugs or any of the chemical substances we release into the environment, rats and mice are our first line of defense. And if side effects are observed, from cancers to neurological effects in rats and mice, it's not fit for human consumption or exposure. And yet, hundreds and thousands of studies in rats and mice have demonstrated the effects of radiofrequency radiation on their biological systems. You take, for example, experiments done on rats and mice, pregnant rats and mice. And these experiments are done with a control group and an experimental group. And the control group are shielded, whereas the experimental group are, for example, exposed to 2 and 3G signals, right? And these would be the type of signals that we use in our everyday mobile phones. And what's been discovered is that the pups that are born to the pregnant rats have, for example, ADHD-like symptoms. They have learning disorders, and when the pups have been subsequently sacrificed as adults, in comparison to the control group, they have abnormal neurological development. Now, what's the impact for human beings? Well, Kaiser Permanente, the US healthcare provider, conducted a long-term study on 914 pregnant women in California. They were each issued with meters to measure their total exposure to radiofrequency radiation. And it was found that females who had the highest exposure were 3 times more likely to miscarry than females who had low exposures. Now, Kaiser Permanente went one step further. They followed up on the children born, children who were born ostensibly they had good births, they were healthy. But what they discovered subsequently in following those children up is that they were 5 times more likely to be obese and 3 times more likely to have ADHD and other issues. And that is significant because these were the children whose mothers had the highest levels of exposure and who didn't miscarry. So we've seen it in rats and mice. We're now seeing it in human beings. So it is absolutely, it's not only disingenuous, it's somewhat criminal to say that, there aren't effects. There are effects. And the precautionary principle in this case should be well and truly applied. And the brakes put on 5G because it's more dangerous than 4G, it's more dangerous biologically than 2 or 3G, and biological effects have already been demonstrated there, so it would seem logical to me not to roll out 5G until we had full studies. But
and of course this is enshrined in EU law. We have the precautionary principle.
We have indeed.
And if we have even one single scientific study that tells us, that casts doubt on the dangers of a new technology, under the precautionary principle, we should not be rolling that out, should we?
We shouldn't, because even one study is one black swan. We're operating, the industries and governments are operating from the perspective that all swans are white. And what that means scientifically is that their theory is that there are only thermal effects for which they can control. that there are no non-thermal effects, and yet we've known since the 1930s from the initial studies on radar and its effect on human beings that there are non-thermal effects. And there have been literally thousands and thousands of studies since then that have corroborated that particular theory. So it's not just one study. There are hundreds if not thousands of them, depending on which aspect you're looking at.
So would you agree that if we've had the governments of Austria, Switzerland and the Netherlands all calling for health reports on this, and by the way, it's my understanding that the people compiling these health reports will be technical people and not medical people, which I think is quite worrying. You've also had the German Federal Office on Radio Protection expressing concern about the higher exposure levels of 5G. So would you agree that the very call for these health reports implies that there must now be a moratorium and a call for the precautionary principle?
Absolutely. And we mustn't forget either, because it just slipped my mind, that the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research in Cancer did, after all, and is something that the eminent oncologist or physicist, Dr. David Grimes, in the BBC video failed to mention, is that radiofrequency radiation has already been classified as a Class 2B carcinogen.
Of course.
And I think it's 28 scientists, independent scientists, who are advising the IARC just this year requested that they reassess radiofrequency radiation, microwave radiation such as 5G, and simply because of the amount of evidence that's come out in experimental and epidemiological studies indicating that it should be a Class 1 carcinogen along with cigarette smoke.
So why do you think the BBC presents this distorted image? It seems to lack balance in programmes such as BBC Click. And, for example, it suggests that campaigners who want to have a moratorium and the precautionary principle, it suggests that they are scaremongering, they're aggressively scaremongering. Would you agree with that?
I don't agree that they're scaremongering. I think that the rollout of 5G has been a wake-up call for citizens across the globe. They've suddenly woken up to the fact that, these technologies may not be as safe as they're being led to believe they are, right? But on the BBC's motivation, I have no idea. I think, the level of ignorance that's being displayed, and that's putting a very kind interpretation by journalists and also by a lot of mainstream so-called experts who, when you look, haven't really looked at the scientific evidence in any balanced way, because the evidence is there, and significantly so. One can only wonder at their motivations. I certainly wonder why the BBC, which is a reputation, is so weak in this area in terms of its reporting. It's not balanced by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you very much. I have one last question. The rollout is ongoing, so not just in Britain, not just in Ireland, but in all the countries, the rollout is ongoing. How urgent do you think it is that we have a moratorium?
I think it's extremely urgent. I think, the potential downside of all this is that we're introducing an environmental toxin in at a global level. It doesn't matter whether you live in a city. A city is going to be particularly affected, and so too are rural areas, because this will be, citizens will be exposed to ever higher levels of radiofrequency radiation at increasing power densities, that will be, and just remember again, they'll be well above the European Academy of Environmental Medicine's guidelines, right? And children are on the front line here. They're the canaries down the coal mine because they're the ones who are going to be most affected in the short term. And whereas people would be worried about cancer, for example, to me, cancer isn't where the immediate effects are going to be felt. It's going to be on children's learning, their neurological functioning, their moods, and the evidence for this, by the way, is being demonstrated in studies on Alzheimer's disease at a global level, but also on a countrywide level, particularly in Sweden, for example. And I have two studies in mind here. One is a Swedish study, one is a general study. And the rates of Alzheimer's, the incidence and the mortality from Alzheimer's since the 90s, when cellular telephony came in, have literally skyrocketed. And it cannot be explained except that there is an environmental pollutant or toxin out there that is causing this.
So we've made major mistakes in the past with asbestos and tobacco. Can we afford to make this mistake? If we make this mistake with 5G, could we come back from it?
From reading the studies from the experts and the long-term experts in the area, they're really concerned that we'll reach a point where for many of us there will be no turning back. The effects on I'm not an expert in genetics, but certain scientists are worried that we will render large swathes of the population infertile, or genetic mutations will creep in that will be problematic. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's their expert opinion, but it is of major concern.
Professor Tom Butler, I want to thank you very much. You've been most informative. I want to wish you all the best for your continued campaigning.
Thank you very much.